two chiefs. We have a chief sustainability officer and a chief resiliency officer, my bosses, that that's basically what they do for the city. So we also, in 2017, started to report on our greenhouse gas emissions through Sustainable Jersey. What did this mean? That meant that we also started our green team, and we got local residents. We started to engage to actually volunteer for the city on behalf of the city. We had our green fair actually on October 2nd. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. But really what I wanted to share was that in 2020, this was actually brought up earlier, last discussion, last panel, that we actually entered a litigation against fossil fuels. We're actually targeting them directly, and we have our next court case coming up very soon. And in 2021, we are actually moving into an energy aggregation program, which we are actually switching entirely over to renewable energy sources for all of our residents. And what we are sending out is actually the option to opt out of it. But if you say nothing, you will be opted in automatically. And if you go to the next slide, this is my contact information up top. So if you'd like to keep in touch, I'd love to. And please share any of your insights. It was a pleasure to meet you all. And I just wanted to leave on just one last thought that Hoboken has more flood risk per capita than the city of Houston. So if you can just keep that in your minds as like a note, and what New York City might have experienced in the last few decades, we experience every year. So just for context. Thank you.
Zach? I think this one's working, right? Maybe. Yep. Okay, good. Thank you, Yasmin. That was great. So thank you all for being here as well. Want to go to that next slide? Got to say, Wolfram, you did a really nice job recruiting people to get here. So I thank you for that. Although for the students, I'm not sure it was a choice. It probably impacted their grade, but thank you for being here. Hopefully you have some questions and we get some good discussions going on. So water is local, right? If we don't take anything else away from this presentation, water is local. I think most people have heard water is life, right? But water is also local, and it's very place specific. So being here, being in this place, in this session about place, thought it was really important to give a context about the local impacts of water and how these conditions are changing with climate change impacts, growth in population, aging infrastructure. And so this is really all about how we need to manage water locally to get through some of those challenges that are ahead. Next slide. Anybody know where that lake is? Close. This is Lake Oroville in California, the second largest reservoir in California. And the biggest problem in that picture is not that there's not enough room for more boats. Okay. The biggest problem is that's one of the largest reservoirs in California, and we have one of the largest droughts that we are facing. And this is happening time and time again, right? Those maps on top of that screen that you're seeing there are continuing to get worse, continuing to get more frequent. And you'll say, okay, well, we're on the East Coast here, right? And thank you for those across the pond being here as well, but you have some of the same challenges. It's not just a West Coast problem. We have other challenges that are ahead that are also local conditions that we need to work through together. Go to the next slide. So as Yasmin really nicely kind of put into context the city of Hoboken, this is happening more and more around the country and around the world. This is a picture showing a wastewater treatment plant that is completely underwater, right? And so we had Hurricane Sandy that was on the East Coast, really impacted everybody on the eastern US. A couple of years before that, we had Hurricane Harvey, right? That was really impacting the South Central United States. And just recently this year, a couple of months ago, we've had Ida, and Ida impacted not only the South Central, but also the East Coast. And a lot of recovery efforts are still going on. So this campus itself was under a lot of water. Towns around here were inundated under a lot of water. And this is happening more and more, getting more frequent, getting more impactful to those communities that are around us. So what can we really, do about it? How are we going to manage this going forward? Slide. Right. So work for a company called Natural Systems Utilities. We design, we build, and we operate local, community-based, decentralized water treatment and reuse systems. Okay, to try to help with some of these challenges that lie ahead. We have about 100 systems in the Northeast that we manage for communities in the Northeastern United States. About 80 of those were directly impacted by Superstorm Sandy. Okay, not a single one of those systems went down and violated permit conditions, while we had large centralized systems that were down, discharging raw sanitary wastewater into our local water resources, right? Creating a lot of environmental impacts and personal impacts as well. And so the reason that these systems didn't go down, didn't fail, didn't violate any permit conditions is because they are local to those communities. They are place specific. We do not have large horizontal pipes that go for miles and miles and miles through many low-lying conditions that when you have an isolated problem, now you're creating a regional challenge, right? Our largest challenge was getting fuel to the generators to keep power to the facilities to make sure they were running and providing clean, affordable, safe water and sewer services to those communities. Okay, we were able to work with the fuel stations that were local, keep those generators running, and keep the environment safe and people having access to that water. So, how can we learn from this? How can we do it better? What can we take away from this and improve in these communities around the world? So, those are some of the challenges that Yasmin spoke about. We had, where water supply certainly is not enough for the demands around, like Lake Oroville being depleted. But these challenges are becoming more frequent. They're getting worse, and they're compounded. A lot of our infrastructure around the world and here locally is hundreds of years old, right? And it's aging. It's inadequate. We can't go a day without hearing about a water main break and something going on. And so this is all causing a rising in our costs, right, for that infrastructure, for that service. The water costs are going up, wastewater services are going up, and that all leads to us trying to work together to be more sustainable, more resilient. How do we actually improve those conditions going forward? So I've used this slide for quite a while now, and it used to say decentralized versus centralized. Because as communities are trying to grapple with how they actually improve these conditions, they were saying, all right, well, do I do a smaller community-based system, or do I hook into my larger centralized system, or do I expand my centralized system? What's the right answer, right? And it's not an either or condition. We really need both going forward, right? It's how do we integrate our decentralized solutions and our microgrids with our larger centralized backbone? How do we do that so that we improve those conditions, okay? There's a lot of what we need to do in terms of getting those resources back, reducing our reliance on those resources, reducing our consumption is really hard to do with a centralized approach. Those centralized treatment systems are located very far from the users, okay? Down near the river is where they are getting flooded, right? Really hard to bring that water or that energy back to those communities that are using it. So let's use these microgrids, just like in the power industry, create a sustainable supply of that water to reuse it and recover that energy at the same time, right? So here's some case studies on how to do that. Go ahead. This is a diagram of Battery Park City, right? Lower Manhattan. And what you're seeing here is just obviously the building envelope on the right-hand side. And what's happening is first, we're trying to conserve as much as possible, use low flow fixtures. All right. All of that wastewater that's being generated is going to the basement of the building. We're treating that right there on site and recycling back up as much as we can for reuse, right? In the form of flush water, irrigation water, cooling tower water, laundry, sidewalk maintenance. Okay, we're reducing our water consumption by over 50%. But more importantly, we're reducing our discharge into the sewer, many of them overburdened by combined sewer overflows that Yasmin went into. We're reducing that by even more because we're using water for external purposes like evaporative cooling. So we're reducing our discharge into the sewer by 60, 70, 80%, right? And so you can do this at the building scale. You can do it at the block scale. We're going to talk about the block scale in a second as we wrap up, okay? Next slide. Right. This is a process flow diagram about how it's done, right? We're not going to go through each of the steps, but you'll see all of the uses on the left-hand side. And what many people get confused about is, well, should I do gray water reuse? Should I do black water reuse? Really depends on your local condition, right? Gray is good, I say, but black is better, okay? When you have more uses, you can get more reuse, more opportunity, the value for that water is better, the return on the investment is better. And you don't have to have multiple pipes and plumbing to separate your gray from your black. So where you do have those types of uses, we prefer to do complete water reuse and take as much as we can and recycle as much as we can. Next slide. So what are the results here? This image that you're seeing up on top is Battery Park City. Okay, it's a 92-acre area, about 20 million square feet of mixed use development space, a lot of it urban infill from the initial trade towers. Okay, and we have about 10,000 people living in Battery Park City. The buildings that are highlighted in green there all have in-building water treatment and reuse systems, reducing their water footprints by over 50%, reducing their discharge into the sewer by over 60%. Okay, so really, really nice example of how you can do things in existing infrastructure, redevelopment areas, and how to integrate these solutions to improve those conditions around. Saw this diagram from Yasmin, but bringing even more local context to not only water conservation, but also reduction on our discharges into our waterways. The right side of this is showing you major combined sewer overflow areas throughout the five-borough area, okay, in New York City. So those large red dots, all right, are greater than 500 million gallons a year of raw, untreated wastewater going into the East River, going into the Hudson, okay, when it rains. We serve 9 million people in New York City, right? We have a lot of wastewater treatment plants, about 14, and about over 1 billion gallons of wastewater being treated daily to service this community that is New York City, right? And when it rains, those treatment plants can't handle it. That water just goes out into the waterways. Next slide. So again, how do we improve this? Let's take it from the building scale to the block scale, right? This is Domino Sugar area. This is on the East River, where one of those large red dots that you saw on the previous slide was, right? So this is a redevelopment of an old industrial area. That Domino Sugar plant, I'm sure everybody's seen the Domino Sugar bags, right? So that Domino Sugar plant, item number C on that diagram, that old brick facade is staying. They're renovating all of the interior. They're keeping the historic context of it. It's going to be commercial space inside. And then the old industrial area around it is now going to be redevelopment of mixed use residential community as well. Okay, so you have 5 buildings. That overall community is going to be discharging 400,000 gallons a day of wastewater. Right? Problem is, it's a really heavily burdened combined sewer overflow district. Right? So not only are we going to be capturing as much as we can and reusing that directly in the community, we're also going to be treating everything, keeping it out of the combined sewer, and actually putting that into the East River to improve stream conditions. Right? So reuse as much as possible, increase stream flow, and actually make that whole area mitigation for combined sewer overflows. Slide. Here's how it kind of looks on a diagrammatic standpoint. You have all those 5 buildings labeled A through E. You have the water treatment and reclamation facility that's highlighted in blue. We're going to capture everything that you're seeing in black there. We're going to run our own little private sewer district in that area, bring everything into the water reclamation facility, treat it, and then send it back through those purple pipes back into the buildings for flush water, cooling tower water, irrigation water, right? And then everything that we can't reuse, there's some uses that we can't reuse for, we're going to treat that and send that into the existing stormwater outfalls, right? To improve those stream conditions. And you can see that combined sewer overflow outfall in green is just south of the overall development. So we're going to keep that raw, untreated water out of that combined sewer so that it's all treated going in. Slide. Right. And as we spoke about, it's not only about reduction in water, it's also how do we integrate our infrastructure to tackle our water energy nexus and tackle our water challenges at the same time as we tackle our energy challenges. When I gave this presentation decades ago, it was, okay, I can see it. This is great from a water environmental standpoint, right? We are treating water, we're keeping it local, reducing our water footprint. That's all great. But aren't you using more energy per gallon of water treated than the large centralized systems? Absolutely true, right? It's like economy of scale, right? But we can get all of those water conservation initiatives and at the same time capture that energy and reuse that energy as well because all the users are there. We don't have miles of pipeline where all of that heat in that wastewater is just dissipating into the environment, right? I always say fish do not need hot water, right? So why are we discharging hot water into our waterways? Okay, so capture that energy, just like a refrigerator operating in reverse, take that thermal energy out of the water, use it to preheat all of the boilers and hot water needs in the community, and now you have net zero or net positive water reuse, and you're really capturing both of the benefits of water and energy, returning that to the Next slide. So in terms of implementing this in your neck of the woods, as you say, a lot of the challenges are, well, my regulations are different, or my conditions are different. Absolutely. Water is local, right? So we put together some guidance documents published by the Blue Ribbon Commission and National Water Research Institute to guide communities about how you do this in your area, right? What are the challenges to work through? How do you get through some of those public health questions? And how do you treat this water? And what do you treat it to for those specific needs? All right, so take a look. It's published through WRF. You can get it online and take a look through it. All right, certainly here for questions as needed.
Thank you so much, Zach.
Welcome.
Great job. Thank you. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Pippa. And the challenge is because we will need to stop screen share. And Pippa, then
share.
you
I was
will
gonna ask.
share your screen. And I'm
Um,
curious how this is going to work. Yes.
Share screen. All right,
Yep,
let's
there you
see.
go. Now you share
I can
your
do this.
screen.
Gonna do it. All right.
And here you are.
And you can see it. Let me go to full screen. Let's see if that works. Let me let me know if that still works. It's black on my screen.
It's black, but oops.
Can you see it now?
This looks perfect.
All right. Okay.
Alrighty.
So
Go ahead.
hi. I have a cold, so I apologize. Really sad to not be there in person because I'm not too far away, just up in New York City. But my name is Pippa Brashear. I am a principal at Scape Landscape Architecture, and we do a lot of resilience projects. What is resilience project? And I get asked this a lot, and I think that's something that we really, want to think and struggle with. And we're talking in this context about resilience to climate change, and I put this definition in because I think that this term is sometimes used and we think of it as simply about risk reduction. But resilience is the capacity of people, communities, and systems to survive, adapt, and thrive in the face of shocks and stresses, and even transform when we need it. So there's really multiple parts to resilience, to climate change resilience. There's the hazards, there's the rising sea levels, there's the growing heat, but there's also where we want to be. We don't think about these hazards in outside the context of us actually living in places and wanting to have successful, high quality lives. And I want to just, I thought about a couple different ways to talk about this, but I want to talk about 3 projects that we've done and how we think about this concept of resilience, particularly resilience in this case to flooding. I want to acknowledge that climate change is bringing many, many different threats and hazards, but I'm going to focus on these because of, because it's really some of the things that we've worked most closely on, and I can talk about how that's been integrated in a design process to really make vibrant places, to reduce and step down the risk, coastal flood risk in particular, but make vibrant places. I'm going to talk about 3 projects, one in Norfolk, Virginia, one in Boston, Massachusetts, and one just between New York and New Jersey off Staten Island. The Ohio Creek Resilience Project is a neighborhood scale flood risk reduction project in Norfolk, Virginia. And for those of you who don't know where Norfolk is, it is the mouth. This little pink dot on all these is that. This is the Chesapeake Bay. It's really a amazingly rich, ecologically and culturally rich estuary on the shore of Maryland and Virginia. And one of the defining characteristics of Norfolk is that it is defined by water. Many people know it because it is a Navy town, a Navy city, but it is really historically defined by these tidal creeks. And if you look at these tidal creeks, these red outlines as the historic shoreline related to what is developed, you see that it much as Yasmin, I don't have to talk a lot about this because it's very similar to what the situation in Hoboken, where the water wants to go where it once went. And the project I'm talking about is down, you see in this bottom right corner, Chesterfield Heights and Grandy Village. And so if I look, this is just a depth of flooding map. You can kind of see these areas that would flood in a that 100-year storm event. And they really start to mark the paths of these historic tidal creeks through the community. And so neighborhood-wide, this is a strategy. This is a resist strategy. It's actually very similar to the delay, storage, discharge, approach that Hoboken is taking. It is a perimeter protection strategy around some of the areas that are really low lying and buildings can't be elevated, and an internal strategy to manage the stormwater, to delay that, to capture it, to store it, to discharge it through pump stations and locations. And at Scape, we kind of plugged into this larger process. You've noticed some references on the slides. We work with Arcadis engineers and Wagner and Ball architects and urban designers to really craft and develop this neighborhood-wide plan. But it's one thing to sort of think about the edge, but how is that edge itself resilient, and how does it start to give back and restore some of the ecological vibrancy and the cultural use that people have of the waterfront? And so as we knew that this perimeter protection was coming in, started to look and develop these different conditions of shoreline that match the use and sort of existing and potential habitats here. And I'm excited to say we did a lot of the conceptual design. VHB, local environmental and engineers, did a lot of the final design for the living shorelines. But this whole project, it's under construction right now. These are construction photos, and you can see that kind of berm winding around the edge. But these layers of living shoreline that step down and start to create a thickened edge that both helps kind of reduce the risk to that coastal infrastructure itself, as well as bee habitat. But the other piece is, one of the places where the coastal defense was cutting through was a park, kind of in the middle of two different neighborhoods. One neighborhood that was slightly less at risk is the buildings were built more recently and were elevated, and they could address it through infrastructure. And the other was very low lying. And so this park was, not in the best of conditions, had barriers that cut it off from the community. It was also one of the roots of these historic tidal creeks. And so one of our big assignments was, how do we redesign this park to make it do all of these things, to make it manage water, protect against coastal defense, deal with the tidal flooding that's coming through this piped creek. And so we said, how do we start to connect the elements around it? A school, a learning center, a learning barge that was on the water, circulation between these two disconnected neighborhoods, as well as integrate flood defense. And it was an opportunity to talk to people about what they want the place to be. This was a park that people used to play ball, but it was actually sort of a divide between these two neighborhoods. There was a whole lot of potential. And so, if you're going to come in, if you're going to transform this neighborhood with this really heavy infrastructure, how do we do it and make it as a place that people will enjoy? And so these were just interactive exercises that we worked with people to get at. And we were able to transform those ideas into amenities and features that people wanted to see as part of this place. Places that brought people together and reconnected routes that were like flooded or not accessible in the past, and allowed people to get up and experience this landscape and see how it was working and manage water. Oops. And so this is a bird's eye rendering of the ultimate design that is this sort of exciting, lush, vibrant place with the programs and amenities that people want to see, but also provides that function. And that function is visible. The perimeter defense, the management and movement of the water so that it can be infiltrated and then excess discharged, and also the restoration of this tidal creek, which helped deal with flooding outboard, but also started to reintroduce people to the understanding that this is a coastal and tidal landscape. It had really been cut off. And you can see water in this picture. This is under construction, but it's already starting to work, right? It's already starting to perform these functions. And so this idea that this park can be a nexus and a place for the physical infrastructure, but also a place for the social and cultural infrastructure, and do that double duty. And as we're thinking about coastal risk and resilience, and flood risk and resilience more broadly, stormwater too, we really need to think about how these things knit together. It is the end of single purpose infrastructure. And so that's sort of how, again, at a neighborhood scale, we've also had the opportunity to work collaboratively with the city of Boston on their plan for climate change. And Boston has a very robust strategy. They were not as impacted by Sandy as New York or Hoboken, but it was still a wake-up call to them to say, hey, we really need to be proactive and get out ahead. And they started a program called Climate Ready Boston, which, one part, they do have a resilient harbor vision, a vision for the whole harbor that we at Scape worked with them on. And it is a strategy really to invest largely in that edge defense system, and combine that with waterfront access and accessibility. But what they've also done is work in individual neighborhoods. And about 2 years ago, we worked with them in Dorchester. Dorchester is the largest, most diverse of all of Boston's neighborhoods. It has miles and miles of coastline, very diverse coastline, and not the same, not the sort of dense inhabited coastline that you see downtown, but really a range of shorelines. And what we looked at here was the current condition. There's actually a fair amount of open space on the Dorchester shoreline, but it is cut off by infrastructure, by highways, by rail lines. And so most of the neighborhood doesn't actually have a direct connection and experience. Unfortunately, that doesn't stop the water from getting in, right? So they're physically cut off, but there are these moments and flood pathways where the water comes in. And so we worked with the city and the neighborhood to say, hey, what if we focus on these areas? We invest in these moments, but remember, it's not just for keeping the water out and managing stormwater, but creating meaningful connections to the neighborhood, again, to have that dual investment. And that is how the project proceeded. We looked at these physical zones within the larger plan that were defined by the nature of that flood risk. We let the water, because water is local, as is made, like we let the water, we can't change, we can't make the water do something we don't want it to do. When I first started working on resilience, I was at an engineering firm and I was a landscape architect. I was like, I got a really long way from just by being able to read a topo map and understanding that water would flow downhill. I think a lot of people, you can't force it to do what it doesn't want to do. And so some places did take that strategy that I talked about with like the Ohio Creek project, where we were able to integrate perimeter protection with enhancements to open space and waterfront access to protect. But the Dorchester plan, unlike many of the other plans in Boston, started to test some other boundaries and say, maybe we can't protect everything. As we look systematically at our edge, what is the highest and best use? And what does it mean to invest in infrastructure? Do we want to create, a wall at the waterfront and try to squeeze access in it just to save, one low rise building that might not, pencil out in 5 years? Or can we start to talk to people about strategic retreat and the trade-offs and a higher and better use for this site for the broader community? So this was one example of that. The other piece, this is a large, the back portion of the land is a large, extensive, tidally influenced river with extensive wetlands. And we were fortunate to be working with Woods Hole Group, a modeling, a coastal engineering and modeling firm as part of this. And you'll see in this upper portion, there's a broad swath of wetlands that exist today. However, with sea level rise and the lack of sediment supply for these wetlands, if we just didn't do anything, if we let those wetlands stay, they would go away. They would be drowned. And they would cease to exist. And so one of the things that we studied is said, what if we managed these wetlands? What if we made sure that they kept up with sea level rise, that they didn't get drowned? And this is often a strategy that's used to reduce waves and soften effects. But what we found here is it doesn't look very big, but you'll see this little purple bit in these two model results, is that if we did that, long term, we could actually affect the depth and extent of storm surge flooding. So simply by caring and managing for the wetlands for the future, we could reduce the extent of storm surge in the 100-year storm. And it might not seem big, but here it was the difference between a transit stop flooding and not. So that could change the entire dynamics of investment for infrastructure over the next 50 years. So what I want to say about this is like, we need to think not just about how we're directly designing places, but new ways of thinking about how we're working with landscape systems that change the whole dynamic and investment in our places. And so thinking about how we as designers, engineers, and landscape architects don't directly, we need to step away from just directly designing to how we engage with these dynamic systems over time. And just to briefly touch on, I think one of our more well-known projects at Scape that I think embodies this idea is living breakwaters. This is a network of breakwaters, these rubble mound structures off the coast of Staten Island. And when we first thought about this project, we were really looking at, not every area can take that perimeter approach. They can't necessarily keep the water out and manage it behind. there are these shallow bay ecosystems connected with communities that might be lower density, that might have that critical connection to the water as part of their economy. And how can we think about the connection of a really targeted, place-specific, locally attitude towards risk with the local culture and the local ecology? And that's what the breakwaters did. That, in Staten Island, the South Shore, you get a lot of flooding, but really the two of the bigger issues here, it's one thing to have a couple feet of water in your living room. It is a totally different thing to have your entire house knocked off its foundation and members of your family swept out to sea, which is what happened during Sandy here. And also the progressive loss of the shoreline over time. That red bit that I show was about 30 years of shoreline erosion that's just eating away at the land that you do have. And so we said, maybe we can't stop the flooding here. That's not an investment that works with the way that people want to live with the water, but we can step down that risk and start to create breakwaters that break waves and storms and stop the shoreline. And this is just modeling that we did to show that. So we're not actually intervening on shore, we're intervening offshore with dynamic processes to change and shape the landscape on shore. And as we do that, we're also, need to be thinking about what we're designing for in the water. Who are we designing for? It's not just people, it's the fish and other aquatic species that inhabit it. These are our users that we're also designing for in this aquatic environment. And so we developed techniques and strategies of integrating habitat through complexity of structure. And sorry, I'm talking fast because I think I'm over time. And integrating in ecologically enhanced armor units and features to build up a breakwater that was not a traditional breakwater, but one that is not an oyster reef, but it serves many of the ecosystem functions that did. So we're enhancing the environment around it. But this is also a cultural aspect. The town on shore was once surrounded by oyster reefs that did help buffer the shoreline and keep that erosion, but it was also a fundamental part of the economy. And so what this project has also done has been able to allow people working with the Billion Oyster Project in New York to pilot oyster restoration techniques that could be applied to the breakwaters, to start to use the breakwaters as a teaching tool in the schools for the regional ecosystem and risk reduction, hands-on, and this is the idea once they're done that they will live on, and also, which we came up with this idea pre-pandemic, and it was, wow, a lot more useful than we've ever thought it would be, to create an online STEM curriculum that use the strategies and methods of the breakwaters to engage people. And they are under construction. So it's not, one piece, but it's this layered approach that really builds that culture of resilience. And so that was really focused on flooding, but I hope that's just some lenses the way we can think about designing with landscape systems to build that climate resilience.
Thank you, Pippa. Thank you very much. And thinking of engaging with dynamic systems, we would like to hand it over to Johannes. If you share your screen and you're ready to roll.
Well, hello from Cologne. Good evening from Cologne. Good afternoon in New Brunswick, as far as I understand. Can you hear me? And is the screen on? All right. I speak from Cologne, where I'm partner at Urbane Gestalt Landscape Architecture Office. And we try to stay cool in 4 projects within the next 15 minutes. Let's see if this is going to the next slide. So from our design thinking, I kind of took away 4 spotlights. On the top left, you see a street that ceased to be a car street, which is a carpet in the city. On the top right, you see a green-blue city square that is about to be created in a dense part of Cologne. Right down, you see a blue-green industrial area that is in development, and down left, it's a climate garden that is teaching about climate change. And all these projects are linking to the typical German discussion on climate mitigation and climate change, and is all situated in different towns some are in the Ruhrgebiet, some are close by at the Rhine River, and so in this region, Western Germany. And I start off in Neuss. This is a project which I know because I'm not the planner of this project, but I'm in the advisory council for the urban design questions of Neuss. And in the middle, you see one of the typical German agendas. It's called Neuss Klimaneutral 2035, and it's really a very complex paper that is aiming at being a climate neutral, carbon neutral city by 2035. And I think you know how ambitious that is. In Neuss, for example, they're aiming about taking 90% of the carbon tons a year that they are having right now. And we all know that, of course, this will be a very, very difficult way to go. But it's most important to start it off. And in Neuss, which is traditionally a very industrial town, they started this discussion off with a project in Sebastianusstraße, which is this little road in the very center of Neuss. And taking out traffic was a very difficult agenda, and there was a lot of protest about it. And that's exactly how this project is to be characterized. It's a project that is starting off a discussion. It's about debate. The whole making of, it's a very cheap project. It's 5,000 euros. So it's only color, and it's also temporary. So here we are really tackling a discussion on how are we going to change the city to make it climate neutral. And what this project is bringing is a really convenient infrastructure. As you heard, we call it multi-layered infrastructure, and you said it's the end of single-purpose infrastructure. I think I learned that from the talk earlier. That seems to be the American English way to name it. And it's really about convenience, to really make people change their mobility on the everyday. Because when we take about taking 90% of the carbon, 30% of it is mobility, individual mobility. And the aim here is to come from about 11 tons a person, carbon a year, to 1. So it's even more than 90% off. So we need to stop riding cars and start to walk and ride bikes in 9 of 10 decisions that we can take. This is also an artistic expression, and what I really appreciate about it is that it's creating a conviviality in the city, which is really aiming at slow motion mobility and also a more complex way to use the city. Scaling up a very little bit slowly, this is a small scale project that is also talking about conviviality in the city. It's a project of Urbane Gestalt. You see in the left, you see an aerial picture, and you see how dense Cologne city in this area is. It's almost completely impermeable because of roofscape and streetscape. And the area to be talked of is in the center picture to be seen. It's right now it's a car parking for a used car sale. Yeah. Very dodgy kind of industry in the middle of the city. And on the right hand, you see the idea how to create something that is actually doing something for community and also doing for the climate mitigation of a metropolis. In a small competition, we handed in, I think it was 5 competitors, and I believe that actually they chose our design because we had the bluest and greenest design. So we're really designing a tree canopy, bringing shadow. We're really designing all possible surfaces that are not used for street infrastructure to be permeable or semi-permeable, and really inviting the people in to have a good life in the city. This is the functions here. So there's a little, starting from left to right, there's a little tree-bound shadow square with an open soil. And the center red piece is actually the central piece of the square, but it's also a means to divide the infrastructure. You see that two gray stripes that are actually street-like infrastructures that are necessary to serve existing and new housing development. And here, this is kind of switching. And instead of using the whole space, we use the top piece of it for infrastructure. Then in the square, we change direction. We use the low piece of the area, and all the rest is designed as green, as open as possible. And then play and also child play is a topic that is integrated. And on the right-hand side, you see again a shaded, not shady, right? A shaded square in the middle of the development. So it's these super small but super important little steps in going away from a very urban and fully closed square typology into something which is green and blue, keeping the water being modeled in a way that we can collect stormwater and in critical moments, that we have permeable soils draining the water. And when we talk about streets, we tried to speak about shared spaces that are fostering slow mobility first and allowing, of course, cars where they are necessary, but fostering pedestrians and bikers. Now, this next project is really different in scale. It's when we talk about all these integrated concepts of climate adaptation and mitigation. This is now the industrial sector, which is also about a third of the problem. The use of energy, of course, is in the main focus. And here in Bremerhaven, the Lune Delta development is a fairly large. I tried to get our hectare thinking into square feet. It's 16 million square feet. And if I'm not completely wrong, it's about half of the size of Hoboken. Well, I don't know exactly about these numbers, but I'm trying to get the square meters across the Atlantic Ocean. So it's really a very large industrial site, and this is it's a project that we did together with City First, and it's from the very conceptual first thinking. It's thought as a cyclical urbanism, integrating a lot of big scale water features and integrating a very complicated energetic network, so that we basically come out with a bilancial carbon-free industrial site, embracing a lot of ideas of the cradle-to-cradle technologies and thinking. For the landscape part, of course, the water and flooding issue was the main task and main focus to be working on, and you can already see it in the master plan map that it's taking also quite a big piece of it. And you already saw that. I put this in to see the relation to Bremerhaven, which is on the top right. So the river is called the Weser, and it's going to the North Sea in some kilometers from this area. But we are behind the dike. So in difference to what we heard before, Hoboken and Battery Park, and also Pippa's examples, this is behind the dike, so it's not directly. There's no direct flood risks on the dike. Along with the water park, which is a park which is working in different terraces, and actually keeping all the rainwater that will be coming in the industrial zone, and then slowly giving it out to the river system of the Weser, which was number one of the landscape issues. Number two was the so-called commons. So we're creating two large parks, including mobility hubs, including kindergartens, including features that are actually connecting that industrial zone and making this industry area something which is much more as a city. So that was for us also a very important idea, that we have to get away from single purpose zoning into really complex urban situations, even if the focus is on industrial use. Here's some of the drawings concerning the water canals and water features. And you see that from this +1, it's actually +1 of ocean level, because we are directly at the sea. We have about 50 centimeters that will be on normal flood, and 80 centimeters that is there for exceptional flood risks. And of course, then some of the infrastructural pieces or some of the meadows and park zones will be flooded for moments. But of course, that's exactly what we are aiming at, integrating these two issues. And this is an image that is putting the landscape that we found in the center of a design for this new to be overbuilt industrial zone, integrating this idea of rainwater storage and rainwater treatment in the very heart of the industrial zone, and making it a space to experience and a space to be, not only for the people working there, but also for the rest of the city that might be there for a visit. So it's this cyclical treatment, which is really in the center of discussion, and then also it's creating place in an industrial zone. The last spotlight I want to put onto a project which is under development for the Internationale Gartenschau. It's a garden exhibition, but maybe Wolfgang can explain that better. The term garden exhibition is not really fitting well. But for 2027, this one is supposed to happen in the Ruhr zone, and it's a multipolar exhibition. And one of the cores is this design for Schwerte, which is directly at the Ruhr River, which is the southern river of the two big rivers in the world. And here in this project, it's really about a climate garden. It's a garden that is teaching sustainability, which I believe is really very special about this project, and somehow it's linking back to ideas of botanical gardens and other parks of back in the days, where we really put a new topic into the center of design, and making people experience, exchange, and experiment. So it consists of this is an overview of the area. It's a shot of 20 meters height, where you see beautifully the wastewater recycling plant and the Ruhr, and a very beautiful Ruhr landscape on the other side of the river, which is a distinct biotop, and used to be still is a water treatment zone. And to have this view, one of the features of the park will be a lookout of where you can reach the 20 meters platform plus 80. And the core of the design is this climate garden, which is consisting of some tiny forest experimental plantings that are kind of creating the place as an internal garden space, fencing off towards the urban neighborhoods. And then it is consisting of 7 rooms, garden rooms, which will be developed in combination also with researchers and universities to really highlight different techniques to produce food within urban systems, and to work in cyclical garden systems. So these are kind of experimental fields, and the heart of it is a big festival meadow with a stage and teaching and learning environment. So these elements that we know from climate mitigation, like tiny forests with shade and collecting water, mixed hedges, nature inclusive design in the garden on the one hand, then it's really the integration of design build strategies and experiment into a project that is good for learning and communication, and altogether creating an educational park together within urban green system. So maybe these 4 spotlights highlight a little bit how the climate mitigation discussion is right now happening in Germany, and how Urbane Gestalt is trying to contribute a very simple, positive message that we can create great places in that age of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johannes. Thank you so much for this insightful talk. And what I find so fascinating about this afternoon is then when we switched from this morning being like all academics, right? Like all these smart people with a whole bunch of letters behind their names. And now we're going into, we have 4 examples, like 4 presenters. Well, we got ourselves, so you got a bunch of letters too, right? But so my point is, from this whole academic conversation coming into case studies that also introduce very smart and very fascinating thoughts. So I loved your term, Jasmine, about the city as a human body. When you think about how elements of the city are interconnected. And Zach, when you were saying like water is local, you think about water as oceans, but definitely water is local. Water is actually where it happens, and it lives where it wants to live. And we can, and when and Pippa, when you were saying like when you were working in an engineering firm in a different time, that you were saying, well, there's no way of us just forcing it or pushing it. We as designers have to appreciate it and work with it. And Johannes, when you walked us through these different scales of projects, and you were picking up actually, well, you were continuing a thought that Robin Lashenko introduced this morning, that whole this discussion on climate change is not only a doom thing, but is a significant opportunity. And so we do have a little bit of time for this, actually quite a bit of time for discussion, even we're a little late, but we can have a really generous coffee break, so we can actually go a bit longer. So the question I would like to reach to the panel to begin with, in terms of your projects, and I may want to start probably with Johannes with Johannes as the last project that we just learned, is where you think about this and your career as a designer, how is this project different than it was probably 15 years ago concerning the whole climate change issue? How did your approach as a design office evolve? And that is actually something that probably Pippa and Zach and Jasmine may also touch on.
Yes, thank you very much, Wolfram. Some of the answers I mentioned also in my short introduction. You know me still from university training. So back in those 1990s and 0 years, I think landscape architecture, at least in Germany, was maybe, to speak in American terms, you would maybe call it a little bit French, a little bit Baroque, really aiming at very clear urban space. The beauty of a square was also defined by the rim that the built environment is creating against the sky when you look up. So it's about urban form and how can landscape and open space answer to that. And of course, that is still true. That still is our duty, that we are working in the city, and we don't want to work against the city. We are not the anti-city planners as urban landscape architects, but the importance of green, the importance of open soil, the importance of touchable and living objects in the city has been increasing in a dramatic way. And I think that is right now really bringing a big footprint into the design processes. And they start to be greener. And well, we talked about, I don't want to simplify it. They really changed. And right now, what I think is really a very important point where we touch with in a lot of our projects is that now that these projects have more complexity, we have big maintenance problems. They love our proposals, but actually none of the communities really know how to keep our proposals alive as soon as they are installed. Right? And that's one of the things where maybe to give a little bit a sidekick to that point is a lot of issues of greenery, of introducing water features, introducing also rainwater management and so on. 10 years ago, we needed to carry them as heavy loads and nobody wanted them. Now they take them from our hands before we even want to give them away. They love them. So the communication has become much easier. But right now it's, as I said, there's a little bit of hype in it, and that we really also need to be very aware as designers. So we are not, that we have to make good and leveled out designs that are providing these features and still maintaining robustness and very vernacular and site-specific qualities. And that's something we learned from the beginning, but we must not forget.
Thank you, Johannes. Pippa.
Yeah, I think, and I had one answer, and then listening to Johannes is another. I picked projects that were actually defined by resilience, like the projects and awareness of climate change. If we were not having awareness of climate change, the rebuild by design competition in New York wouldn't have happened, and we wouldn't have had living breakwaters. We wouldn't have had Hoboken. Boston wouldn't be doing this. So that is one lens. There are just new spaces and places for designers to work and bring our skill sets and communication and creation of place to. But it's also about how we, it has changed how we approach our projects. We don't design a plaza anymore without a really robust stormwater management system. As Johannes says, like, no one's pushing back against us using green infrastructure. It was an uphill battle for like a decade. It's not anymore. But I agree with the maintenance piece. And I think that, Zach, we can take a page from your playbook working within the building systems, that are much more defined and constrained. Like if no one's written the book on it, you have to do it yourself, right? They're like, oh, the rules don't let us do it that way. We can't reuse water. We can't manage it this way. We don't know how to maintain these plants. Like, we're realizing we have to start writing the playbooks for that. And so I think we're reframing our role. In terms of, how it's changed design on a day-to-day project or like a normal landscape project, I think it's broadened people's awareness and thinking about who and what we're designing for, right? We had these like very focused, defined programs, and you reiterated, like, at the end of single purpose infrastructure is over, right? We can no longer be designing for like today. No one's only thinking about designing for the people who are there today. It's for the people who are there tomorrow. I think there's an attitude of do no harm, right? We've looked at how traditional infrastructure has dealt with hazards in the past, and we've seen that it's too fragile. It has negative impacts on people, downstream, or for the purposes or functions that it wasn't used for, right? Levees have destroyed the sort of natural sediment movement in Delta River Basin. So we're rethinking the whole perspective. And the other thing that I think is really important is accepting uncertainty. And this has been amazing as a landscape architect. And I think why I gravitate towards like coastal engineers, because they're two professions where like nothing that we've ever designed is when we build it, right? You cut the ribbon on a landscape and like you designed something for a tree that's not going to reach that maturity for 10, 20, 100 years. Whereas I think we've often thought about like static systems, like when the design is done, it's done. People come in, they use it exactly as it is. And we know with a changing climate, I think, has made more people aware that we don't know what's happening, and we have to design for an uncertain future, and we need to design things that are adaptable and changeable, and think about those maintenance plans. So I think those are kind of the themes that this presence of climate change has threaded through like all of our design work.
I just want to say Wolfram and Pippa have both said water is local, so my job is done.
Yeah, it's a good phrase.
It's a great question. You know, most people think, okay, great, this technology is now available. No, I mean that's not what's changed. You know, this technology has been around for a long. You know, water reuse and membrane bioreactors and hollow fiber membranes. We've been doing it since the 80s. It's just the realization, the recognition, the understanding of the need for this is now becoming a lot more popular. People are starting to understand what it really means to do this and how it can be integrated to change those items. I used to, you know, do these conferences early 2000s, and you know, people are on site, decentralized, community based. I mean, what are you talking about? And we would have a 15-minute session on a Sunday during a football game when nobody was at the conference because conferences started on Sundays and they go to Wednesdays usually. And we were never talking during primary, you know, talks. It was always the large centralized kind of systems. Now people are realizing that, okay, we have water benefits here, we have energy benefits here. We can integrate these solutions to really make a more thoughtful kind of system. And I think that's what's changed. And we are understanding, Pippa, very well put, that the regulations don't need to be there for these systems to be put there. We need to make that happen. The regulations in Battery Park City were not there when we first designed these systems. We worked with the Battery Park City Authority, worked together to put those guidelines in place. And so now people and communities are realizing that they can do this. So that's really, for me, well, from in the past 10, 20 years, which changed the most. It's people's understanding that we can make a difference, and it's just working through those challenges locally to do that with those local stakeholders.
To add to what Zach and Pippa and Johannes were saying, yeah, I agree. I think in the past 10 to 15 years, the projects have definitely changed. It used to be of what works now. You know, I need to get water to my house. I need to have a sewer. I need to have this. I need to have that. Okay, it's very short term, very temporary. But with climate change, you know, you really do have to think for the future. You do have to think about, and it in planning terms, we have this term called NIMBYism, NIMBY, not in my backyard. Okay, so whenever we speak to people, they say, well, why should I care? It's not my problem. You know, it's not happening to me personally. Why do I need to act on this? And what we do is, you know, policymakers, as planners, as engineers, as professionals, we say, no, this is happening to you. And we, even regardless if it's not, you know, we should be acting on this right now. This is important. This is something that we need to do now. And so that is really the tactic that we use in Hoboken is really engaging with the community. And I mean, we've been very fortunate that the community has said, you know, we don't want our houses flooding. We don't, we don't want to have issues. And they are very much engaged with us, which has been wonderful. But then again, you have NIMBYism and you have sometimes even environmental justice and equity issues when it comes to that, because, you know, where does the water go if I put up a levee? Where does the water go if I, you know, don't really look at the entire city holistically? It goes typically to those areas, those low-lying areas. And so you don't want that to happen. You really do want to look at everything holistically. You really do want to regulate it using policy, using new laws, ordinances, and regulation. I mean, that is important. That is what makes it stick. You know, it's really great when you have bottom up. It's really great when you have these activists and you really fighting for, you know, change, really fighting for resiliency. But when you have the actual law, when you have the actual ordinance, whatever it is, the regulation, it sticks. And, you know, it's hard to change once you get to that point. So I think that, you know, coming from a city, that's what we always strive to do. We say, okay, we got to do this. Okay, we're going to write an ordinance. We're really going to, you know, get everybody on board with this. We're going to make it happen and we're going to make it stick.
Yes, so our profession actually has changed, the field has changed. And for all these young professionals in here, the room, so I would like to give you the opportunity. Is there any, hopefully there's probably a question, a thought, a concern, and take this opportunity. We are among us, so there's no no other, like only very few adults in the room. So please feel brave and take the opportunity to ask something, share a thought, because this is very much about where you will be, right?
And we got a lot more students in the room that were
Yeah.
by choice.
Right.
Right. So that's great. See you guys all here.
No, no, you need that. Otherwise, nobody, Johannes and people will not hear you.
First of all, thank you for great presentation. But one thing that really hasn't been addressed is the idea that in most of these projects, there's a use of fund capital. And that's becoming more accepted, but it's never accepted without sort of an eye on the return on the investment. And so when you calculate the return on that investment, including both the direct benefits of whether it be storm surge protection or flood hazard reduction, as well as the indirect benefits of whether it be recreation or education or habitat enhancement or whatever services are being offered, is that number getting closer to reality where people are really willing to accept it today?
Whoever.
I'll take a first stab at it, and then we'll get out of this. So it is improving. I'll start there. Look, most people don't recognize that our water infrastructure was subsidized years and years and years ago, and ROI was not a thing, right? And now that municipalities are starting to run out of money, water prices are increasing. There is a realization that we need to work together. So public and private funds are coming together to finance these in many cases. However, because of the needs in various areas, those that are putting in this infrastructure are recognizing that that return on investment cannot be a year, right? And they're starting to recognize that 3, 5, 10-year returns on investment are required to put these things in place that are needed. So I think it's recognition that this is not going to be subsidized again, unless we get further funds coming through. We need to work together to do that. How do we do that? And where are the kind of important factors in completing that? So there's various ways to now fund these. Either the developers are funding them directly and recognizing that a 10-year investment is acceptable, or sooner, because the water and wastewater prices are increasing all across the country and across the world. So we're getting to the point that now these things are affordable because we really haven't been paying for the true cost of water, for ages. So that recognition is now there, and these funds coming together are getting to the point where a 10-year return on investment, which may have been not accepted 10 years ago, is now accepted by many communities.
Yeah. This is I can add to that too. We I'm not an economist, and we are often working as a design firm, but this idea of return on investment needs to be there. The problem is so much bad behavior is subsidized. So much unsustainable and unresilient behavior is subsidized, and the economics for how to measure the hard and direct things are well beyond the science of it, and the tools of it are well beyond the tools we have to value social and cultural and ecological components. So even if we start to develop the tools to measure them, they end up being undervalued. And we found that, working on Able by Design, we found that working on Climate Ready Dorchester. So I think there's an economic component of doing what Zach's saying, and the internalizing the externalities, letting those costs drive up. That's wildly complex because it needs to be partnered with policy. It needs to think that do no harm thing I said before. There's a huge equity issue because at least in the transition period, the people who are going to be impacted are the people who can least afford it, and have been marginalized traditionally, right? So that's a huge lift. But in the interim, we can't not act. We can't not do these things, try to do them, fund them. So I think that it's not always going to be a straight up economic argument or quantitative argument. It's going to have to be qualitative. And that's where, planning and strong narratives and advocacy and design and the tools of design to illustrate to people that they can do this, or the tools of, advocacy to say, like, this is a better way to live. This is going to make you happier. This is going to be more beautiful. This is going to be the place you want to raise your children in. Is going to be part of that return, like part of that balance of return on investment as well. So it's challenging though, but whether qualitatively or quantitatively, we do have to convince people that this is a positive return on investment and show that it is.
Thank you, Pippa and Zach. I mean, I agree. I think that return on investment, you know, you could look at it from a social perspective. You could look at it from, you know, solely financial perspective. You know, for us, return on investment really does have to do also with quality of life. You know, when you are risking your quality of life, your safety for something like flooding, for something like climate change, it's, you know, think about the costs of rebuilding, think about the costs of relocating, think about those costs. And just keep those on the back burner when you also are thinking about trying to invest for, you know, climate mitigation and climate adaptation measures. I know for Hoboken, like for instance, the Rebuild by Design project was primarily funded by the state and federal government. We got a lot of subsidies for that. You know, we are doing a lot of resiliency projects in part from that grant, from that funding, you know, such as our resiliency parks. And as a city government, local government, we do a lot of our work from the federal support, from the state support. We don't really do our major infrastructure projects from, you know, local city taxes or something like that. That's not really where most of our funding actually comes from. But that being said, when you think about the return on investment, when you think about the big picture, it is rather new in the sense that, you know, using renewable energy, for instance, or using, you know, trying to guide towards LEED certified buildings, which are, you know, sustainable building designs. When you look at them, you want to look at cost savings and utilities. That's really the way to indicate if your return on investment is actually working. We did a reporting recently for CDP and ICLEI's Race to Zero, which is more on a national and international scale, where we were comparing our emissions, our usage to you know, future years. And we actually, Hoboken had a direct install program where we were working with PSE&G, which is our utility company, and we were actually trying to get, you know, direct install utilities to certain buildings. I think it was like 13 of ours, municipal buildings, including the library, but I mean, that's besides the point. But one thing that I had to report on was to see if it was working, if we were going down, if our usage, if we were saving money. And in fact, we were. So I think that it's working. I think it's worth the investment. I think that you're not going to see it maybe short term, but you will long term.
Yeah, I would like to mirror this
Yep.
across the Atlantic shortly. I mean, of course, this question is an important question, and now we already had 3 answers. I want to add one thing, which is I would say it's a new narrative. The new narrative means the best project ecologically, the best project we do is the project we don't do. So simple answer is we don't do things that are not necessary. And the rest, at least in Germany, is mostly organized by rule making, by policy making. So, for example, if we are creating new neighborhoods, actually we have enough. But if we have to create new neighborhoods, then they must not deliver more than, now comes numbers, 3 liters a second in hectare of rainwater into the next river or something. And if that rule is applied, you have to do a very thoroughly thought and sustainable rainwater system. So maybe that's one component driven by the narrative of non-building is the most ecological building. We have to fit through that gap. And the other narrative that I would like to introduce, because We always have to do that as landscape architects. We must never stop. What we do is also cultural practice. So yes, return on invest discussions are always there. But for example, thinking on this garden exhibitions on the garden that is educating people in the Ruhrgebiet, landscape architecture here is a cultural practice.
Thank you so much, Johannes. And actually, I got the sign by our director running the TV system. We need to stop. That's kind of what happens with
Cut off.
with this whole hybrid thing. Like we are under a different. So I saw there was actually like a request for a conversation. So we can actually do this in this very brief coffee break. So we should be back in the three different panel rooms at 3 o'clock. And thank you so much for your attendance and for your listening and for the great conversations. Thank you, Pippa. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.
Thank you.
All the
This was
best.
great.